Another byproduct of the large industrialization, commercialization of America is income growth and income disparity. So, because of America's growth, you had a large unequal distribution of wealth that eventually would emerge, especially in cities. New York, for example, you have a culture of immense wealth and society that would now emerge in New York City that would form its own subculture. And these very wealthy people would oftentimes form clubs, and they would have elaborate social rituals. It was like an unofficial membership. You had to be a part of a social elite, wealthy, high society. New York. That sort of subculture exists in New York to this day. That being said, it really was put on display at around this era, largely because of the immense wealth. And oftentimes, as people have egos and whatnot, you would have people who would display their wealth. Large, elaborate mansions, maybe a horse carriage to take them in and around the city. Uh, they would have various different goods, various different social establishments and parties around this time, elaborate parties with all kinds of opulence and other aspects of wealth that only the very wealthy could have. Okay? Um, Often said in New York City, you have Central Park, which was built to give people in a small clustered area a respite, a park to give people an idea to kind of escape. Okay, that was the idea behind Central Park. What Central Park largely became was a place where New York high society members could take their carriage rides to kind of escape from um, daily life in a more elegant setting. So you have wealthy people who establish the idea of carriage rides, trying to get away while they're in the middle of a crowded city because they can. And that became a status symbol in and of itself. Very wealthy, opulent New Yorkers. So if you ever seen the sitcom Friends, the coffee shop where they largely congregate is called Central Perk, very Friends oriented. Otherwise, though, that's a play on words for Central Park. Okay. Aside from very wealthy, you have the other extreme. You have a large, lower, poor class society emerge due to various different issues. And oftentimes it was centered around immigrants as well. A lot of immigrants would come and it'd be poor. And oftentimes there would be prejudices against immigrants, largely because they were poor and they were different, and there would be various different stereotypes that would be built in and among them. Oh, immigrants, oh, they're going to be poor. Poor. Yeah, whatever. Okay. No matter, though, in the United States, what still existed, though, whether somebody was very wealthy or very poor, was social and geographic mobility. Okay, so despite disparities, you still had opportunities to move and improve your lot in life and to ascend from an economic standpoint, largely because there were still vast amounts of lands available out west. So if you were an immigrant in New York, or if you were otherwise poor, you might still have an opportunity to move out west and change your situation, therefore improve your station in life. So that is something that still existed in the United States despite some of these disparities that came about in the commercial era. And it's something that's different than European countries around that era as well. So yeah, you have very opulent people. You have a high class, a high society that developed in places like New York. You also have a significant amount of urban poor. But around this era, you really started to see an emerging middle class in America. So while the very rich and the poor were very visible, most everyday Americans, just like today, are somewhere in between. We're in the middle. So you have an emerging middle class where people could prosper without owning vast amounts of land, but maybe you provide a service. Maybe you run a small shop. Maybe you have a small business and you engage in trade. You may have some sort of profession to where you're able to make a living for yourself and do pretty well. So you're comfortable. Maybe you're certainly not opulent, you're not very wealthy, but you're certainly not destitute and poor. You're providing for yourself. You're doing okay. And that's where majority of us in America are. And it was really this era that started to solidify America as having a large middle class life. And what also defined the middle class was that various different distinctions were broken down, largely because you could build a middle class society in cities. So, yeah, you have that very high social class and you have the destitute as well. But you could have cities lined with middle class housing. If you've ever been in New York City, you might see some of these houses that I'm talking about in various different neighborhoods. You can kind of walk up, they're brownstones. Those are middle class houses that were largely advented in the era of the 1840s and 50s as you had an emerging middle class. People weren't living in streets, but they also weren't living in mega mansions as well. They had a modest but comfortable living arrangement in cities, largely around this time. Another thing that was advented around this era that most middle class families had was a cast iron stove. With a stove, that replaced wood or coal burning fireplaces that now made cooking more feasible and efficient. Now you had greater control over food preparation. You could bake your own bread. You could put things on the stove and cook meals in a far more efficient manner. This changed the way people ate. It changed people's diets. And because you have the advent of cooking, you're now able to do various different things and eat more consistently. That changed the way people carried on healthy lifestyles. They could eat at more regular intervals, and it improved overall standard of living because people were able to feed themselves in a more efficient manner. So the cast iron stove really changed the way that people ate. Plus, also now you have railroads that could take goods across the country in a far more efficient manner. They could take fruit, vegetables, other foodstuffs, deliver them, meat, dairy products. You have the advent of the ice box, a primitive refrigerator for you who don't know what an ice box is, that may be able to help store food for longer periods of time, or else maybe keep them cold over longer periods of time, therefore delivered over longer periods of time. People have fresher foods, meats, dairy, fruits, vegetables. Now you're able to cook with them on your cast iron stove, improving your everyday lifestyle.